I've had a few strange experiences in my life, but here's one of the creepier ones I've personally had. My parents live in a house built in the 1760s on the coast of southern Maine. It's a centered chimney cape with a long L off the back. When they first purchased the house, I did some research on the property and the owners through the years. The house was built by the Eaton family and was handed down through the family from generation to generation until about 1860, when it was sold. Between 1820 and 1830, the Eaton family lost both parents and 8 of the 9 children to premature loss, most of them gone because of tuberculosis. I had returned home from college to stay with my parents during winter break. January in Maine is bitter cold, and in an 18th century house, all the more so. My little sister, who was about 15 at the time, and I were sharing a bed, partially for warmth, partially because I'm a sissy, and the damn old place has always creeped me out a bit. The bed was in a downstairs front room of the house. The only other person in the house at the time was my younger brother, who was in the back L, far across the house from us. I woke up around 8 a.m., rather abruptly because I could hear intensely labored breathing coming from my sister. At first I thought she must have come down with a terrible cold and was really congested. I lay there for a couple minutes and then finally rolled over to check on her because it sounded awful, like an asthma attack or a death rattle. When I rolled over, I immediately saw she was on her side facing me, wide-eyed. She whispered, "That's not you." The noise continued, and it was loud. There was nothing subtle about it, and it was coming from the bed, directly between us. We jumped out of bed, checked under the bed, checked the entire room, and the while, the breathing continued. Finally, at a loss, we just stood on either side of the bed, facing each other, and listened in disbelief. It stopped abruptly. I have no explanation for that. My parents have owned the house for almost 10 years since then, and a variety of odd things have happened, though no one else has ever heard the labored breathing, which I rather think is just what it would sound like if, say, a person were dying of tuberculosis.
My brother was helping me across the country. We borrowed a van and loaded everything up for the last trip. Just before we left, I checked my watch and called my GF that we would be hitting the road soon. My brothy checked the kitchen clock, but only told me later he did. We set out, but couldn't do more than 80 kilometers per hour because of the load. When we took the off-ramp of my new city, my brother told me he couldn't remember the trip. When I thought about it, neither could I. We both thought we were tired and thought nothing of it. However, when we arrived at my new house, my GF asked if I broke the speed limit because we were almost an hour early. When retracing the route, my brother and I both agreed that we can remember passing a certain gas station and nothing thereafter until the off-ramp. To this day, we have no clue what happened during that hour we're missing or how we could have traveled that fast. Not with any car or van at least. Now at the beginning, I wrote we both independently checked for time. This is important for us because one time source could have been wrong, but not both. Also, I called before we left, which limits the time we could use to travel. Since then, we have never experienced any weirdness like it or otherwise. I don't have any weird memories or dreams, no piece of metal lodged under my skin, etc. Just an hour I lost. What is your scariest true story? There's an abandoned house next to mine. The previous owner moved out to California 25 years prior and never sold it. I got a flashlight, gloves, and pushed the window open and went inside, starting with the basement. In the basement was a grand piano, still plays, but very much out of tune. Old WW2 stuff. What seemed to be a signed Elvis poster. Some other really cool things no one should ever leave behind. There's basically a whole story in that basement, including a broken wedding picture frame and instruments everywhere. On the main floor was an unmade bed, molded food still in the fridge and on the stovetop. Half-empty beers turned solid. Lights that still hadn't been turned off. Then I started walking upstairs when I heard crying from one of the side rooms. That's when I lost my mind for a second and haven't been there since.
What is your scariest true story? When I was about 6, my sister was babysitting me one night in our small Texas town. It was winter, dark outside, and we were watching a crime show about a man who murdered his neighbors and kidnapped their kid. About halfway through the show, bang, 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 someone starts pounding on our front door. We froze. A minute later, we hear the storm door outside slowly close, which meant someone had actually been there. We sat in silence. The only light was from the kitchen. Then, from behind us, the back doorknob started to rattle. And suddenly, bam, 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 someone tried forcing the glass door open. The whole wall of windows shook. My sister screamed, dragged me to her room, and barricaded the door with her mattress. She grabbed the phone and, panicking, just hit redial. Luckily, it was her friend. Minutes later, headlights pulled into our driveway. Whoever it was, vanished. All we found were strange scuff marks on the back door. We never found out who was trying to get in. I had a guy tell me a story a couple decades ago about how he was hiking in an area in South America and wandered away from other hikers in the area. The ground was wet and without warning, it gave away and he got sucked into a fast-moving underground river, pitch black, completely submerged, and at the mercy of the current as it buffeted him against the sides of the tunnel. After some time, the current subsided and he realized he was in a larger pocket, still pitch black and submerged. He said that even as he struggled to hold his breath, he didn't panic and realized that the water had to keep moving somewhere. So he moved around until he found another tunnel that sucked him in. At one point he began to see light, so he punched upwards, broke through the ground, and pulled himself out, soaking wet, gasping for air, and a bit of a distance from the other dry hikers, who were somewhat bewildered when they saw him straggling up to them.
My dad worked in a morgue during college in the 60s. One time on the night shift, he was training a recent hire who was wheeling a body down the hallway. The body was under a sheet, but all of a sudden started to sit up. The guy immediately freaked out, ran out the doors, and quit. Apparently a dead body can have muscle contractions in the abs, causing it to start sitting up. The more you know, I guess. When I was around 10 years old, I had this incredibly disturbing dream. It started with me alone in my house during the day. It was a small place, several minutes' walk to the nearest neighbor, surrounded by woods. I heard something coming slowly down the driveway, like tires crunching on gravel, but at a dragging, unnatural pace. Curious and uneasy, I stepped onto the porch and saw an old-fashioned covered wagon being pulled down the drive. For some reason, the sight filled me with dread, and I bolted back inside, locking every door. Once I was sure the house was secured, I crept into the basement, where I knew I could look out through the small window in the door. The wagon came to a stop, right as I peered out. A man climbed down from the seat. He wore a black suit and a tall black top hat, and he stared straight at me through the glass. Once he knew I was watching, he walked to the back of the wagon and pulled off the cover. Inside were bodies, hanging from the supports, their feet dangling, ropes around their necks. They looked dead until the man did something, and their heads began to swell, grotesquely. Their faces puffed up to cartoonish proportions, eyes bulging, skin turning red, necks stretched taut.
A few summers ago, I went for a bike ride around midnight with a friend. We went our separate ways at the end of the evening, and I had about 2 blocks to ride back by myself. Because of construction, I had to ride on the sidewalk, but the streets were dead. But it wasn't a problem until right where I was about to turn left onto my street. There was this man walking by himself, maybe 40s, a little scruffy, but not homeless. The sidewalk was narrow, and I didn't want to freak him out, so when I got about 6 feet behind him, I said, "Hey, behind you." And he turned around and gave me this super angry look. I turned down Me Street and he started to follow me, literally screaming about how I was a freaking idiot and he was going to finish me and all that. I live right off the corner and I didn't want him to figure that out, so I decided to do another loop around the block. That's not the scary part. The scary part is that when I looped back around and looked down the street, I saw him standing on my FKN front stoop staring out at the street like the mother lover knew I lived there. He saw me ride by again, but he didn't say anything. I ended up going back to the friends, but my bike got stolen from the alleyway by the house 2 days later. I can't leave my bathroom. About 30 minutes ago, I got out of the shower, put on my pajamas, opened the door, and walked out, only to find myself back in the bathroom, staring at the closed door. I thought I imagined it, so I tried again. Same thing. Every time I walk out, I end up back inside. I called my mom. She came over and said she was standing outside the bathroom calling my name, but I couldn't hear her. When she removed the lock, she told me the bathroom was empty. She even sent me a photo. My bathroom with no me in it. On my side, the door is still closed and the lock untouched. I tried the window. At first it wouldn't open, then it did, but outside, it wasn't daylight anymore. Everything looked muted, wrong. I blinked and suddenly the window was closed again, with the blinds back in place like nothing happened. My mom thinks this is some kind of prank. She left with her friend after showing me a photo of the empty bathroom. But I'm still here. Weirdest part, I ripped down the shower curtain just now, but when I looked again, it was back, hanging in place. My phone is dying. If you don't see an update, assume I never got out.
Well, it's my story. When I was a little kid, we had this neighbor like grandma to me. I'd go over and have snacks, and she had a Mr. Potato Head I played with that was her now adult son's toy. Weird core memories. He came home, in his 20s, from the army, I think. I don't remember much about him, but he asked about taking my older brothers camping, but my mum said no, she had a weird feeling about him. There were no locked doors, everyone trusted each other. My mum saw him at our little store with bee stings all over, and was concerned. He said he got them at the creek. She thought that was weird, because that's just not a thing where we went all the time, but okay. A little while later, the news said there was a murder of some campers out past where we lived. No leads. People were shocked. This doesn't happen here. My mum remembered her weird feeling and the bee stings that didn't make sense. She called the police to say, "Hey, probably nothing, but here's what I got." I remember detectives coming to our house to talk to her. They had some other evidence that matched, but not enough to link him to the incident. It's unsolved to this day, though the detective said he knew it was him. A few years later, the guy went to prison for an attempted crime act of a woman who ran out of gas, and he offered her a ride. She lived, thank God.